Before we begin, I want to warn you that this story contains sensitive content, including themes of betrayal and heartbreak. This is a true-life story, and though the events are real, the names of the individuals involved have been changed to protect their privacy. Viewer discretion is advised. I never thought I'd find myself telling this story. My name is Gina Thompson, and for a little over a year, I believed I had found my forever with Joseph Newman. We weren't just dating, we were building a life together. We lived in a cozy little studio apartment, made plans for our future, and despite the occasional ups and downs, I truly thought we were solid. But as it turns out, love isn't always what it seems. What I'm about to share with you isn't just a story about infidelity. It's a story about trust shattered in the most painful way, about being blindsided by the person you thought you knew best. And it all began with those late nights at the kava bar. Let me take you back to a cold December evening, the kind of night where the chill seems to seep right into your bones. Joseph had started spending more and more time out, always at the same kava bar, always until the early hours of the morning. At first, I didn't think much of it. He'd tell me he needed space to clear his head, that he was meeting friends or just wanted some time alone. And I believed him. Because why wouldn't I? He still smiled at me like he used to. He still said all the right things. But then, the cracks started to show. For 3 weeks, Joseph disappeared every single night. At first, I chalked it up to stress. Maybe something was going on at work, or maybe he was just going through a phase. He was still affectionate, still called me babe and kissed me goodnight when he finally stumbled through the door in the early hours. I told myself not to overthink it, but deep down, a tiny voice inside me kept whispering, "Something's not right." And that voice grew louder and louder. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. It was 3 a.m., and Joseph still hadn't come home. I sat there in our tiny apartment staring at my phone, debating whether to call him or just wait it out. My mind was racing with 1,000 questions. Why was he spending so much time there? Who was he really with? Was I just being paranoid? Finally, I grabbed my coat, slipped on my shoes, and headed to the kava bar. I told myself I was overreacting, that I'd find him sitting with a group of friends, sipping tea and laughing about something silly. But when I walked through that door, my heart sank. There he was, Joseph Newman, the man I had shared my life with, the man I had trusted completely, sitting at a corner table with a woman I barely recognized. Her name was Emma Sanders, and she wasn't just anyone. She was the girlfriend of Joseph's best friend, Daniel. They looked so comfortable together, leaning in close, whispering like they had some secret no one else was allowed to know. And in that moment, I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My hands started to tremble, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. When Joseph saw me, his face changed. He didn't look angry or surprised. He looked guilty. The kind of guilt you can't hide, no matter how hard you try. I didn't even know what to say. All I could do was stand there, staring at him, waiting for some kind of explanation that I already knew wasn't coming. "Gina," he said, his voice low and shaky. "Let's go outside. We need to talk." I followed him out into the cold night, my chest tight with dread. I wanted to believe that there was some innocent explanation, that I had misunderstood. But as soon as we stepped outside, he looked at me with eyes that were too calm, too rehearsed. "I'm not feeling it anymore," he said, his words cutting through me like a knife. "The spark is gone." The spark is gone? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Just days before, we had been talking about visiting his family for the holidays. We had made plans for the future. And now, here he was, standing in front of me, telling me that everything we had meant nothing. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the full story, and my gut was screaming at me that there was more to this than he was letting on. As I stood there in the freezing cold, trying to process what had just happened, Joseph went back inside. Back to Emma. And I realized, in that moment, that everything I thought I knew about our relationship was a lie. But this was just the beginning. What I discovered over the next few weeks would unravel everything I believed about love, trust, and loyalty. It would leave me questioning, not just Joseph, but myself. And as painful as it was, I knew I had to confront the truth. Because sometimes, the only way out of heartbreak is straight through it. Looking back now, I can't help but wonder, How did I not see it coming? How did I miss the signs? Was I blind or just too in love to notice the cracks that were already forming? I used to think Joseph and I had the kind of relationship that everyone else envied. But as I replay it all in my head, I realize that what felt like perfection back then might have been an illusion all along. Let me tell you about the Joseph I thought I knew. When Joseph and I first got together, it was like something out of a movie. He was charming, funny, and attentive. Everything I thought I wanted in a partner. We met through mutual friends, and from the moment he walked into the room, he had this magnetic energy that pulled me in. He wasn't just the guy who cracked jokes or lit up every conversation. He was the guy who made me feel seen. Truly seen. Our first date was simple: coffee and a long walk by the river. But by the end of it, I already knew this wasn't going to be just another fling. Joseph made me feel safe, like I could tell him anything, and he'd never judge me. He had this way of looking at me, like I was the only person in the world that mattered. And I'll admit, I fell for it. Hard. A few months later, we moved into a cozy little studio apartment together. It wasn't much, a single room with a kitchenette and a creaky bed frame, but it was ours. We decorated it together, picked out plants, hung up photos of our happiest moments. It was the kind of place where every corner held a memory. Movie nights on the couch, lazy Sunday mornings making pancakes, dancing in the kitchen to old songs we both loved. It was our little world, and I was convinced it was unshakable. We talked about the future all the time. Joseph would say things like, "When we get married," or "when we have kids someday," as if those were inevitable milestones, not distant dreams. He made me believe we were building something real, something lasting. And for a long time, I never doubted that. Not once. But then, little things started to change. Not all at once, just small, almost imperceptible shifts in his behavior. At first, it was easy to dismiss them. After all, every relationship has its ups and downs, right? It started with his phone. Joseph had always been pretty open about it, leaving it on the counter, letting me borrow it to look something up. But one day, I noticed he started keeping it face down. He'd get a text, and instead of casually glancing at it, he'd turn the screen away or shove it into his pocket like it was some kind of state secret. When I asked him about it, he just shrugged it off. "Work stuff," he said. "Nothing you need to worry about." I wanted to believe him, so I let it go. Then there were the late nights. Joseph had always been social, but suddenly he was going out more and more, always to the same kava bar. It started as once or twice a week, which didn't bother me much. I figured he needed time with his friends, and I didn't want to be the clingy girlfriend who demanded he stay home. But soon, once or twice turned into almost every night. He'd leave after dinner, promising he'd only be gone a couple of hours, and then come stumbling back at 4 or 5 in the morning. When I asked him why he was out so late, he'd always have an excuse. "I just lost track of time," he'd say, or "it was good to finally catch up with the guys." And for some reason, I believed him. Joseph had this way of reassuring me with just a look, a smile, a soft word. I never imagined he could be lying straight to my face. But even as I told myself everything was fine, there was this gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. A feeling I couldn't shake. There were moments, fleeting but powerful, when I'd catch him staring off into the distance, lost in thought. Or times when he'd pull away from me during a hug, just a fraction of a second too soon. It was like he was physically there, but emotionally, somewhere else. One night I tried to bring it up. I told him I felt like we were drifting apart, that I missed the way things used to be. He took my hands in his, looked me right in the eyes and said, "You're overthinking, Gina. I love you. You're my person. Nothing's changed." And for a moment I believed him. I wanted so badly to believe him. But the signs kept piling up. I started noticing other things too. Subtle things that, at the time, didn't seem important, but now feel like glaring warning signs. Like the way he started dressing a little nicer before heading to the kava bar, putting on cologne when he hadn't before. Or how he'd sometimes come home smelling faintly of perfume. One that wasn't mine. Then there was the day I found a stray bobby pin in the passenger seat of his car. It wasn't mine, and when I asked him about it, he just laughed. "Probably one of the guys messing around," he said. I didn't push. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but deep down, I felt the cracks widening. I think part of me knew something was wrong long before I let myself admit it. It was like standing on a beach, watching the tide slowly pull back, knowing a wave is coming but not knowing how big it's going to be, or how much damage it'll do when it hits. And yet, despite all the red flags, I still clung to the idea of us. I told myself it was just a rough patch, that we'd get through it, like we always did. I blamed myself for feeling suspicious, for doubting him. After all, Joseph wasn't just my boyfriend. He was my best friend. My partner. The person I thought I could trust more than anyone in the world. But trust is a funny thing. It can take years to build and only moments to destroy. And on that night in December, when I walked into the kava bar and saw Joseph sitting there with her, Emma Sanders of all people, I felt that trust shatter into a million pieces. I wasn't prepared for what came next. I wasn't ready for the lies, the excuses, the heartbreak. But the truth has a way of forcing itself into the light, no matter how much you try to ignore it. And once it's out there, there's no going back. I can still hear the hum of the tires as I drove to the kava bar that night, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. It was late, well past midnight, and the streets were eerily quiet, as if the universe was holding its breath. I didn't even know what I was looking for. Answers, maybe, or reassurance. Or just proof that I wasn't going crazy. But nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to find. The kava bar wasn't packed like I'd imagined it would be. There were a few scattered groups, laughing softly over their drinks, but the place was mostly calm. My heart pounded so loud in my chest I was sure the people around me could hear it. And then, I saw him. Joseph. He was sitting at a corner table, leaning in close to someone. At first, I couldn't make out her face, but I recognized her laugh, a soft, almost musical sound that I'd heard before. That's when it hit me. It was Emma Sanders. Emma wasn't a stranger. She was Daniel's girlfriend, Daniel, who had been Joseph's closest friend since college. I'd met her at parties, game nights, casual gatherings. She was always bubbly, always kind, and I never once imagined she could be part of something like this. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. They were sitting so close their knees were almost touching, and Joseph had that smile on his face. The one he used to give me, the one that made me feel like the most important person in the room. It was a private smile, one that didn't belong to her. But there it was, plain as day. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but somehow I forced myself to move. Before I even knew what I was doing, I was walking toward them. My hands were shaking, my chest tight, but I didn't stop. "Joseph," I said, my voice louder than I intended. Both of them turned to look at me, and in that moment, I saw it. Guilt. Emma's eyes widened, and she looked down at the table as if she could will herself to disappear. Joseph's face drained of color, and for the first time in our relationship, I saw him look truly terrified. "What is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What the hell is going on here?" Joseph stood up quickly, his hands raised as if to calm me down. "Gina, it's not what it looks like," he stammered, but his voice cracked under the weight of his lie. "Not what it looks like?" I snapped, my voice rising. "You're sitting here with her, Daniel's girlfriend, and you're telling me it's not what it looks like? Do you think I'm stupid?" Emma mumbled something I couldn't hear. Her face beat red, but I didn't care. My focus was on Joseph, on the man I thought I knew, the man who was standing there, unable to meet my eyes. "Let's talk outside," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I laughed, a bitter, humorless laugh that felt like it came from someone else. "You want to talk now? After this?" But I followed him outside anyway. I think part of me was desperate for him to say something, anything, that would make it all make sense. That would undo the betrayal I'd just seen with my own eyes. The air outside was cold, biting against my skin, but I barely noticed. Joseph turned to me, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders hunched like he was bracing for impact. He wouldn't look at me. "I'm not feeling it anymore," he said finally, his voice flat, emotionless. "The spark is gone." For a moment, I didn't even understand what he was saying. The spark is gone? That's all he had to say? After everything we'd been through, everything we'd shared, he was throwing it all away for her? "This isn't about a spark," I said, my voice cracking. "This is about you cheating on me, with Emma, of all people. How long has this been going on? He shook his head. It's not like that, he said. We haven't done anything, nothing physical. We've just been talking. Talking? I repeated, my voice rising. You expect me to believe that? You've been sneaking out every night, lying to me, and now you're telling me it's just talking? Do you think I'm an idiot? Joseph didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at the ground, and I felt my heart shatter into a million pieces. The man I loved, the man I trusted with everything, wasn't fighting for me. He wasn't denying it. He wasn't even sorry. I don't remember driving home that night. It was all a blur. Tears streaming down my face, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. By the time I got back to our apartment, my hands were trembling so badly, I could barely get the key into the lock. When I walked inside, the place felt different. It no longer felt like home. The photos on the wall, the blankets on the couch, the little knickknacks we'd collected together, they all felt like lies. I sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor, my mind racing. Had I been blind? How long had this been going on? And why? Why Emma? Why someone so close to our circle? Someone we both knew. I wanted to believe it wasn't true. I wanted to convince myself that Joseph was just confused, that this was some kind of mistake. Maybe we could fix it. Maybe, if I gave him space, he'd realize what he was throwing away. But deep down, I knew the truth. I'd seen the way he looked at her, the way he defended her. He wasn't confused, he wasn't making a mistake. He'd made his choice. For days after that, I lived in a state of denial. I told myself we just needed time, that this wasn't the end. I even asked Joseph if we were still going to visit his family for the holidays, and he said yes, as if nothing had happened. I clung to that promise like a lifeline, convinced that if we could just get through the trip, we'd find our way back to each other. But in the back of my mind, the doubt lingered. I couldn't stop replaying that night in my head, the looks on their faces, the way Joseph had shut down, the way Emma had avoided my gaze. The truth was right in front of me, and yet I couldn't bring myself to accept it. I wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. The holidays have this way of making you believe in magic, in miracles, in second chances. And I think that's why I held on to the idea of this trip so tightly. Even after everything that had happened, after finding Joseph with Emma at the kava bar, after the cold, hollow words of our breakup, I convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, this trip could save us. Maybe we could fix what had been broken. Maybe we just needed time away from it all. But looking back, I realize now that the trip wasn't going to save anything. It was only going to expose the truth I wasn't ready to face. In the days leading up to our trip, things between Joseph and me were strange, to say the least. We were still living together, but we barely spoke. It felt like we were walking on opposite sides of a tightrope, both trying to avoid the inevitable fall. He was distant, more distant than ever, and I couldn't ignore the changes in his behavior. For starters, he started guarding his phone like it held the nuclear codes. He'd never been like that before. He used to leave it on the table, unlocked, without a care in the world. But now, it was always with him, always tucked away in his pocket or face down on the counter. If it buzzed, he'd glance at the screen quickly, then shove it back out of sight. And when I asked him about it, he brushed me off. Work stuff, he said again, the same excuse he'd been using for weeks. And then, there were the nights. He wasn't going out as much anymore, but when he was home, it felt like he wasn't really there. He'd sit on the couch, scrolling through his phone, or staring off into space, barely acknowledging me. And when he did speak, his words felt rehearsed, like he was playing a part he no longer cared about. Still, I tried to hold on to hope. I told myself that this was just a rough patch, that once we got out of the apartment and spent some time together, things would get better. I even started daydreaming about how the trip might bring us closer. Long drives, quiet nights by the fire, laughter and stolen kisses like old times. I was desperate for a sign that we could still be us. But the closer we got to the trip, the more I felt that sinking feeling in my stomach, the one that whispered, "This isn't going to end the way you want it to." The drive to his family's house should have been our chance to reconnect, to talk, to figure out where we stood. But instead, it was the longest, most excruciating 3 hours of my life. Joseph barely spoke to me. He kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly I could see his knuckles turning white. The silence between us was deafening. Every now and then, his phone would buzz, and he'd glance at it quickly, his jaw tightening before setting it down. He thought I didn't notice, but I did. And every time it happened, my heart broke a little more. When we finally arrived, I thought things might get better. His family was warm and welcoming, the kind of people who made you feel like you belonged. But even there, Joseph was distant. He spent most of his time on his phone, sneaking off to the bathroom or out for drives by himself. When he was with me, he seemed distracted, like he was counting the minutes until he could escape again. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. He'd been gone for hours, claiming he needed some fresh air, and I was sitting in the guest room alone, staring at my suitcase and wondering why I'd even bothered to come. When he finally walked in, I tried to talk to him. I told him I missed him, that I felt like he wasn't really there with me. "I'm just tired, Gina," he said, his voice cold and dismissive. "Can we not do this right now?" That was the moment I realized he didn't care. He didn't care about how I felt, about what this trip meant to me, about saving what was left of us. And yet, even then, I wasn't ready to let go. It wasn't until our second-to-last night there that I finally found the courage to confront the truth. Joseph had fallen asleep next to me, his phone tucked under his pillow like a secret he was trying to hide. For hours, I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with all the possibilities. Was I overthinking everything? Was I just being paranoid? Or was there something he wasn't telling me? I don't know what finally made me do it. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was that voice in the back of my head that wouldn't let me rest until I knew. But as quietly as I could, I reached under his pillow and pulled out his phone. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it. He'd never bothered to change his passcode, a small detail that almost made me laugh through the tears I could feel forming. And then I saw it. The messages, the photos, everything I had been afraid to find. There were texts from Emma, pages and pages of them, filled with inside jokes, flirty banter, and memories they'd shared. He'd been with her the night before we left for the trip, staying out until 5 a.m. He'd told her he missed her, that he couldn't wait to see her again. There were photos, too, of her cutting his hair, of them on dates, of her sitting in his lap with that same smile I used to think was meant for me. My chest tightened as I scrolled through the evidence, my mind screaming at me to stop, but my heart refusing to let go. Each message, each photo was like a dagger, cutting deeper and deeper until I could barely breathe. And then, as if on cue, Joseph stirred beside me. I quickly set the phone back under his pillow, my heart racing as I lay there, pretending to sleep. He didn't wake up, but I knew in that moment that I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep holding on to a relationship that was already gone. The morning after I found those messages, I woke up feeling like a stranger in my own skin. I could barely look at Joseph, let alone speak to him. But I knew I couldn't keep quiet. The truth was out, and it was eating me alive. I needed answers, even if they destroyed me in the process. It was just the two of us in the car on the drive back home, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. My fingers drummed nervously on my lap as I rehearsed the words in my head, over and over, trying to figure out how to start. But when I finally spoke, it came out as a whisper. "Joseph, are you going to tell me the truth, or should I say it for you?" He glanced at me, his knuckles tightening on the steering wheel. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice strained but trying to sound casual. "You and Emma," I said, the words catching in my throat. "I saw the messages. I know everything." For a moment he didn't respond. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Then he sighed, this long, exaggerated sigh, like he was the one being inconvenienced. "Gina, it's not what you think," he said finally, his tone defensive. "We didn't even do anything. It's just, we've been talking." "Talking?" I shot back, my voice rising. "Joseph, I read the texts, I saw the photos. Don't stand there and tell me it was just talking." He shook his head, his jaw clenching. "Okay, fine. Maybe it was more than talking, but nothing physical happened until after we broke up. Technically, we weren't together when things got serious." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Are you actually trying to justify this by saying we were technically broken up? Joseph, you ended things with me because of her." You've been lying to me for weeks, sneaking out, hiding your phone, acting like I was the crazy one for being suspicious. Do you have any idea what that's done to me?" His face hardened. "I didn't plan for this to happen, okay? It just happened. It just happened." I laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and hollow. "You didn't just happen to start seeing your best friend's girlfriend. You didn't just happen to throw away everything we had for her. You made a choice, Joseph. You chose her over me." For the rest of the drive, he didn't say a word. And honestly, I was glad, because anything he could have said would have just made it worse. When we got back to the apartment, the full weight of our situation hit me like a ton of bricks. We still lived together. In a tiny, suffocating studio apartment. There was no escape, no room to breathe, no way to avoid each other. And now that the truth was out, things went from awkward to unbearable. Joseph made no effort to hide his relationship with Emma. He didn't bring her to the apartment, at least not while I was still living there, but he might as well have. Every night, he'd go out and spend hours with her, leaving me alone in the place that used to feel like home. Sometimes he'd come back smelling like her perfume. Sometimes he wouldn't come back at all. And when he was home, it was even worse. He barely acknowledged my presence, except to ask me one thing. "When are you moving out?" It would be nice to have her over freely. That question felt like a slap in the face every single time. As if I were the inconvenience. As if I hadn't just spent a year building a life with him, only to be discarded like I never mattered. I tried to keep my head down, to avoid him as much as I could. But in a space that small, it was impossible. Every time I looked at him, I saw everything we'd lost. Every time he walked past me, I felt the weight of his betrayal all over again. And every time he picked up his phone and smiled at her messages, I felt like I was being stabbed in the chest. I stopped sleeping. Every night, I'd lie awake in that tiny apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of our relationship in my head. I'd think about the way he used to hold me, the way he used to look at me, the promises he made. And then I'd think about Emma, about the way he was probably holding her now, saying the same things to her that he once said to me. The sadness was unbearable, but the anger was even worse. I was angry at him for what he did, for how little he seemed to care about the pain he caused. But I was also angry at myself, for not seeing it sooner, for not walking away the moment I found out, for still somehow loving him even after everything. There were moments when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, when the weight of it all felt too heavy to bear. I'd break down in the middle of the day, crying so hard I couldn't breathe. I stopped eating, stopped taking care of myself, stopped reaching out to friends. It felt like I was stuck in this endless loop of pain, anger, and heartbreak, with no way out. And yet, through it all, I kept telling myself that things would get better. That once I moved out, once I put some distance between us, I'd finally be able to start healing. But in the meantime, I was trapped. Trapped in a space that used to be filled with love and laughter, but was now suffocating, toxic, and empty. There were good days, though they were few and far between. Days when I reminded myself that his choices didn't define my worth, that I deserved better than someone who could so easily throw me away. Days when I allowed myself to imagine a future where I was free. Free from him, free from the pain, free to rebuild my life on my own terms. And as March 1st drew closer, that future felt a little less impossible. I started saving every penny I could, counting down the days until I could leave that apartment for good, until I could leave Joseph, Emma, and all the heartbreak they'd caused behind me. But until then, I had to endure. And every day was a battle. It's been months since all of this happened, but the questions still haunt me. They linger in the back of my mind, surfacing when I least expect them. Sometimes I'm washing dishes or lying in bed at night, and suddenly it's all I can think about. The pain has dulled, but the questions remain sharp, like tiny splinters I can't quite remove. Do relationships that start with infidelity last? I think this is the question that eats at me the most. If Joseph and Emma could betray the people they were supposed to care about the most, me and Daniel, what does that say about the foundation of their relationship? Can something that begins with lies and betrayal ever truly survive? From what I've read, relationships that start this way rarely work out in the long run. Sure, they might feel exciting at first, fueled by secrecy and the thrill of breaking the rules. But once the dust settles, reality sets in. Trust becomes a problem, because how can you trust someone who is capable of betraying someone else? How can you build a future with someone whose past is built on dishonesty? I don't know if Joseph and Emma will last. Part of me hopes they don't. It feels like justice. But another part of me has realized that it doesn't really matter. Their relationship isn't my responsibility, and it isn't my burden to carry. Whether they succeed or fail has no bearing on my own happiness. Letting go of that question has been one of the hardest and most freeing things I've done. Will he ever feel remorse? This question kept me up at night for a long time. I wanted to believe that Joseph would, at some point, realize the gravity of what he'd done. I wanted him to feel the pain he'd caused me, to regret how carelessly he treated me and everything we'd built together. But the truth is, some people never feel remorse. Maybe they're too selfish or too blind to the hurt they've caused. Maybe they're just too focused on their own happiness to think about anyone else. And maybe, just maybe, Joseph falls into one of those categories. I don't know if he'll ever regret what he did, but I've come to understand that his remorse, or lack thereof, doesn't define my healing. I used to think that an apology from him would somehow fix things, but now I know that it wouldn't. What I needed wasn't his regret, it was my own closure. And I've had to find that within myself, not from him. Why does it seem like everyone else moved on but me? This is the question that broke me the most. Joseph moved on almost immediately, parading Emma around, taking her on dates, living his life as if nothing had happened. Even Emma's ex, Daniel, seemed to bounce back quickly. He cut ties with her, started seeing other people, and didn't look back. Meanwhile, I felt stuck. I was still living in the same tiny apartment, surrounded by memories I couldn't escape. I was still crying myself to sleep some nights, still waking up with a heavy heart. It felt like the world had moved on without me, leaving me behind in the rubble of my broken relationship. But over time, I've learned that healing isn't a race. Everyone processes pain differently, and just because someone seems to have moved on, doesn't mean they aren't struggling in their own way. I've had to remind myself that my journey is mine alone, and comparing it to others only makes it harder. Healing takes time, and that's okay. If you've ever been through something like this, I want you to know that you're not alone. Infidelity has a way of making you feel small, like you weren't enough, like you did something wrong. But let me tell you this, their betrayal is not your fault. It's a reflection of their choices, their weaknesses, their inability to value what they had, not a reflection of your worth. I know the pain feels unbearable right now. I know there are days when it feels like you'll never get past this. But you will. I can't tell you when or how, but I can tell you that healing is possible. The first step is letting go of the things you can't control, their actions, their choices, their happiness, and focusing on the things you can control. Your own healing, your own growth, your own happiness. Take it one day at a time. Some days will feel impossible, and that's okay. On those days, be kind to yourself. Surround yourself with people who love and support you. Allow yourself to feel your emotions, even the messy ones. Because pretending you're okay when you're not will only delay the healing process. And remember this, you are not defined by their betrayal. You are not defined by what they did to you. You are strong, you are resilient, and you are capable of building a life that's better than anything you could have imagined. As I sit here, reflecting on everything that's happened, I realize that I'm not the same person I was before all of this. And maybe that's a good thing. I've learned how to stand on my own, how to find strength in myself instead of relying on someone else to give it to me. I've learned that healing isn't linear, but every step forward, no matter how small, is progress. If there's one thing I want you to take away from my story, it's this. You are worth more than the way they treated you. You deserve love that is honest, kind, and unwavering. And even though it might not feel like it right now, that kind of love exists. It starts with learning to love yourself again. So to anyone out there listening, anyone who's been through heartbreak, betrayal, or loss, I see you, I hear you, and I promise you, there's light at the end of this tunnel. The boxes are packed, the lease is signed, In just a few days, I'll be moving out of this tiny studio apartment and into a space that's entirely my own. It's strange to think about, leaving behind the place where I laughed, cried, and loved so deeply. But it's time. It's time to close this chapter, to leave the ghosts of Joseph and Emma behind me, and to start building a life that's mine and mine alone. For so long, I thought the hardest part of this betrayal was losing Joseph, losing the person I thought he was, the future we'd planned together. But now I see that the hardest part wasn't losing him, it was finding myself again. Picking up the pieces of who I used to be, before the lies and the heartbreak, and learning to trust myself once more. And while it hasn't been easy, I can feel the weight beginning to lift. Each day I'm a little stronger. Each day, I take another step forward. Because as much as this experience has broken me, it's also taught me one of the most valuable lessons of my life. I am enough. I was always enough, and no amount of betrayal can take that away from me. To anyone watching this who has ever felt the pain of betrayal, who has ever had their trust shattered, I want you to know this. You are stronger than you realize. There's no right or wrong way to heal, and there's no timeline for moving on. But one day you'll wake up and realize that the pain doesn't define you anymore, that the person who hurt you doesn't hold power over you, that you've survived something you thought would destroy you, and you've come out the other side stronger for it. Sometimes healing means letting go of the closure you think you need. Sometimes it means forgiving yourself for holding on longer than you should have. And sometimes it means simply getting through the day, one moment at a time. But no matter where you are in your journey, remember this. You are not alone. Your story matters, your healing matters, and your future is worth fighting for. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you been through something similar? How did you find your way forward? Your advice, your stories, your encouragement, it might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. So please, don't hesitate to share. This community exists to support and uplift each other, and your voice is an important part of that. And if you're still in the middle of your own heartbreak, I hope my story shows you that healing is possible. It's messy, it's painful, and it takes time. But it is possible. And I promise you there's a light at the end of this tunnel, even if you can't see it yet. So here's where I leave you. Not with a perfectly wrapped up ending, but with hope. Hope that tomorrow will be just a little bit easier than today. Hope that you'll find the strength to let go of what's holding you back. And hope that you'll discover the kind of love and happiness that you truly deserve. Because even in the darkest moments, there's always a way forward. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for being part of this journey with me. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your story in the comments. I'll see you in the next episode, where we'll continue to uncover the truths that rarely get told. Until then, take care of yourselves, and remember, you're stronger than you think.